July 7, 1944, the island of Saipan, Mariana Islands. Captain Ben L. Salomon, a 29-year-old dentist from Los Angeles, stood in a battalion aid station just 50 yards behind the American front lines. In the pre-dawn darkness, he could hear the sounds of wounded soldiers arriving, carried by exhausted medics from the battle that had been raging for 3 weeks. What he couldn't know was that within hours, he would face a test that no amount of dental training had prepared him for, and that his actions would save dozens of lives while earning him a place in military history. The recognition, however, would take 58 years to arrive. Ben Salomon was born on September 1, 1914, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the only child of a Jewish-American family. From an early age, he demonstrated the qualities that would define his life: athletic prowess, natural charm, and an innate gift for leadership. These traits made him popular among his peers and respected by his teachers. After attending Marquette University for a short time, Ben transferred to the University of Southern California to pursue his real ambition: becoming a dentist. He completed his pre-dental studies and matriculated into USC's dental school, graduating in 1937 with strong grades and excellent clinical skills. By 1940, Dr. Ben Salomon had established his own dental practice in Los Angeles. The practice was successful, his patients liked him, and his future looked bright. Then, in the autumn of 1940, his number came up in one of the first drafts held by the Selective Service Administration after the passage of the Selective Training and Service Act. The twist was that Ben was not drafted as a dental officer, which his degree would have qualified him for. Instead, he entered the United States Army as an enlisted man, a private in the infantry. What happened next would become legendary within his unit. During basic training at the 2nd Infantry Regiment, an orphan regiment used primarily as a holding place for manpower, Ben Salomon discovered he had an extraordinary natural talent for weapons. The regimental officers organized competitions to make training more interesting and to identify their best soldiers. Whether it was the pistol, the rifle, the bayonet, or the machine gun, Ben Salomon won every competition. It didn't matter what weapon they put in his hands, he mastered it with remarkable speed and accuracy. His superiors took notice. Ben was quickly promoted to sergeant and made chief of a machine gun section in the Heavy Weapons Company. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, he was assigned to one of the small islands in the South Pacific, waypoints on the flight path to Australia and New Zealand. There wasn't much to do except build fortifications and continue training on all infantry weapons. Ben continued to excel, becoming an expert in small unit tactics and defensive operations. But back in Washington, the War Department was facing a different kind of crisis. When they instituted the first draft in 1940, they believed they had plenty of dentists. By 1941, they realized they were badly mistaken. The Army needed dentists desperately to maintain the oral health of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. A soldier with an infected tooth or severe dental pain couldn't function effectively in combat. The War Department discovered that they had inadvertently drafted approximately 100 dentists as enlisted men, including Ben Salomon. The Army sent out letters encouraging these men to seek appointments as commissioned dental officers. Ben Salomon did not respond. He was happy as an infantry sergeant, doing what he loved and clearly excelling at it. The encouragement became directives in the autumn of 1941, and the Army began actively drafting dentists. By the end of the war, nearly 13,000 dentists would be conscripted to serve the force. Ben received another letter, but this time it contained orders. He was going to be commissioned as a first lieutenant in the United States Army Dental Corps, whether he wanted to or not. He tried to ward this off. One of his commanding officers even recommended that he be commissioned as a first lieutenant of infantry instead, recognizing that Ben's talents were wasted in a dental clinic, but this was war and orders were orders. In August 1942, Ben L. Salomon was commissioned as a dental officer and transferred to Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. He picked up his practice of dentistry, and apparently it came back to him fairly easily. He was highly respected and esteemed by the patients he treated. His chairside manner was excellent and his technical skills were solid, but Ben Salomon's practice was unusual in one critical respect. In the morning, he would see patients at the dental clinic. In the afternoon, he returned to the field with the 105th Infantry Regiment and taught infantry tactics. His commanding officer would later say that Ben was the best teacher of infantry tactics that the regiment had. He taught small unit defensive operations, the use of automatic weapons, and how to hold positions against superior forces. These were lessons born from his years of training and competition, refined through study and practice. Within a year, these lessons would be put to their ultimate test. In late May 1944, it was time for those infantry tactics to be put into use. The 105th Infantry Regiment, which was part of the 27th Infantry Division, received orders for a major operation. They were being assigned to help the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions eject Japanese defenders from the island of Saipan in the Mariana Islands. Saipan was not just another Pacific island, it was strategically critical to the American war effort. Capturing Saipan would allow B-29 Superfortress bombers to operate within direct range of mainland Japan, fundamentally changing the air war. The Japanese understood this perfectly. They had fortified Saipan with approximately 30,000 defenders, well entrenched in caves and on cliffs throughout the island. These were not green troops or garrison forces, they were experienced soldiers who had been ordered to hold the island at all costs. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, was a veteran officer who understood that losing Saipan would be catastrophic for Japan's war effort. The American invasion force arrived at Saipan on June 15, 1944. The Marines hit the beaches first, supported by massive naval bombardment. The fighting was immediately intense. The Japanese had prepared elaborate defensive positions, and they contested every yard of ground. Initially, Ben's unit, the 105th Infantry Regiment, was held in reserve. On June 21st, they received their first mission, clear the Nafutan Peninsula. This was rugged terrain overlooking the Aslito airfield, heavily defended and extremely difficult. The battle for Nafutan Peninsula was brutal. The 105th Infantry Regiment suffered heavy casualties clearing the Japanese positions. Ben Salomon, the dentist, took on the position of battalion surgeon for the 2nd Battalion. It was an unusual assignment for a dental officer, but the battalion's actual surgeon had been incapacitated, and Ben was the best available replacement. His medical knowledge, while not as extensive as a physician's, was sufficient for battlefield triage. More importantly, his leadership qualities and his combat knowledge made him effective in the role. After clearing Nafutan Peninsula, the 105th Infantry Regiment was moved to the northwest side of the island. By the evening of July 6, 1944, the 2nd Battalion had established a defensive perimeter near the coastline. Behind them was the ocean. In front of them were the remaining Japanese forces, which intelligence suggested were running out of supplies and would soon collapse. Ben established his battalion aid station approximately 50 yards to the rear of the front lines and about 30 meters from the coastline. It was a standard field hospital setup, a large tent with surgical equipment, supplies of morphine and bandages, and space for perhaps a dozen wounded men to be treated simultaneously before being evacuated to the rear. Across the way, in the Japanese command post, Lieutenant General Saito was writing what would be his final order. He had taken stock of his remaining forces, and the situation was hopeless. His troops were out of ammunition, out of weapons, out of food. They could not continue much longer. The Americans had nearly complete control of the island. Rather than accept defeat and surrender, Saito wrote a special order that lauded his troops for their conduct, but laid out a final mission. He ordered a gyokusai, a suicide charge in which every Japanese soldier was expected to give up their life by taking 10 American lives. It was a desperate, fanatical order, but one that fit within the military culture of Imperial Japan, where surrender was considered dishonorable. Saito and Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the task force that attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941 and was now trapped on Saipan, went off together and committed suicide around midnight. They would not live to see the results of the order they had given. Shortly after midnight on July 7th, probing attacks by Japanese forces hit the American defensive lines. These were not the main assault, just advance elements testing the American positions and looking for weak points. Around 4:45 in the morning, the full fury of the attack arrived. Somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 Japanese soldiers, many of them armed only with bamboo spears and bayonets, poured themselves against the American positions held by the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment. Witnesses who survived would later describe it as a human tsunami, a wall of humanity charging with suicidal determination. The noise was overwhelming, thousands of voices screaming battle cries, the crack of rifle fire, the chatter of machine guns, the explosions of grenades and mortars. Ben Salomon's aid station began taking on casualties immediately. Wounded soldiers were carried in by medics or stumbled in on their own, bleeding from bullet wounds, shrapnel, and bayonet injuries. Ben and his medical staff worked frantically to stabilize the wounded, administer morphine, apply tourniquets and bandages, and prepare men for evacuation to the rear. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The sheer weight of the Japanese attack was overwhelming the American defensive positions. Some positions were overrun. Japanese soldiers penetrated deep into the American perimeter. And then Ben heard one of his patients cry out. He looked up from the soldier he was treating to see a Japanese soldier inside the aid station, bayoneting one of the wounded Americans who lay helpless on a stretcher. Ben grabbed the nearest weapon, an M1 Garand rifle that belonged to one of the wounded soldiers. He raised it and shot the Japanese soldier dead. The man fell in the tent, blood pooling on the ground. Before Ben could return to treating his patient, 2 more Japanese soldiers came through the front flap of the tent. These were not stragglers or lost soldiers. This was a deliberate assault on the aid station. Ben acted with the reflexes and skills he had honed as a machine gunner and infantry sergeant years earlier. He clubbed the first soldier with the rifle stock, a devastating blow that dropped the man. He shot the second soldier at point-blank range. Then he bayoneted the first soldier as he tried to rise. 4 more Japanese soldiers crawled under the tent flap from the sides, attempting to infiltrate the aid station from multiple directions simultaneously. What happened next occurred in seconds, but would be seared into the memory of the witnesses who survived. Ben shot 1 soldier, he bayoneted a second. He headbutted a third with such force that it stunned the man. He knocked the knife out of the hand of the 4th soldier, scrambled to retrieve it, and stabbed that soldier to death. A wounded American soldier whose name was not recorded but who was conscious and armed shot the 3rd intruder as he tried to recover from Ben's headbutt. Ben straightened up and assessed the situation with the tactical awareness of an infantry officer. Japanese soldiers were pouring into the area. The aid station was directly in the path of the assault. His patients, wounded men who could not defend themselves, were in immediate danger of being massacred. He realized in that instant that the unit had been overrun. The defensive perimeter had collapsed. The Japanese breakthrough had reached his position. Ben gave one order to his medics and corpsmen: "Get the wounded to the rear. I'll hold them off." Those were the last words anyone ever heard from Captain Ben L. Salomon. The medics, understanding what Ben was ordering them to do, began evacuating the wounded. Some of the wounded who could walk helped carry those who couldn't. They moved toward the rear, toward the coastline, trying to reach safety. Ben stepped outside the tent to buy them time. He saw immediately that the situation was even worse than he had thought. Japanese soldiers were everywhere, moving through the American positions, overwhelming foxholes, engaging in hand-to-hand combat. The main defensive line had been shattered. About 30 yards away, Ben spotted a machine gun position. The M1917 Browning machine gun was still there, but its operator was dead, slumped over the weapon. Ben ran to the position, pulled the dead soldier away, and checked the weapon. It was still functional with ammunition remaining. He swung the heavy machine gun toward the advancing Japanese soldiers and opened fire. The M1917 was a water-cooled, belt-fed machine gun capable of sustained fire. In trained hands, it was devastatingly effective, and Ben Salomon's hands were very well trained. He had been a machine gun section chief. He had won every machine gun competition in his regiment. He knew this weapon intimately. Burst after burst of .30 caliber rounds tore into the Japanese formations. Soldiers fell in groups as Ben traversed the gun back and forth, creating a killing zone in front of his position. But the Japanese kept coming. This was a gyokusai, a suicide charge. These men had been ordered to trade their lives for American lives, and they were determined to do so. They charged Ben's position in waves, dozens of men at a time, many armed only with bamboo spears or bayonets. Ben kept firing. When Japanese soldiers got close to his position, he shot them at point-blank range. When the ammunition belt ran out, he reloaded with the speed born of endless practice and continued firing. The noise was deafening, the chaos complete. Blood and bodies surrounded the position. At some point, Ben realized he needed to move. The Japanese were massing for an attack from a direction where the machine gun couldn't effectively engage them. Despite being wounded, he struggled to move the heavy M1917 machine gun. These weapons weighed approximately 103 pounds with water and mount. Moving one while under fire and wounded was an extraordinary feat of strength and determination, but Ben managed it. dragging the weapon to a new position where he could cover a different approach. He set it up and continued firing. Witnesses who were at a distance and survived would later report that they could see the machine gun position still firing long after the aid station had been overrun. They didn't know who was manning it, but someone was still fighting. Hour after hour, Ben held the position. He moved the machine gun 3 more times during the battle, each time dragging it to a new location to maintain clear fields of fire against the attacking Japanese. Each move left a trail of blood in the sand from his wounds. The Japanese tried repeatedly to overwhelm his position. Some got close enough to throw grenades, others charged with bayonets fixed. Ben fought them all off, using the machine gun at distances ranging from several hundred yards down to just a few feet. On July 8th, after the Japanese attack had finally been beaten back and American forces had regained control of the area, Major General George W. Greiner, the division commander, arrived with his staff to survey the battlefield. The division historian Captain Edmund Love accompanied him along with several enlisted men. They were documenting the carnage, trying to understand what had happened during the chaotic night battle. They came across a machine gun position. Slumped over the 1917 Browning was a body. The man's finger was still on the trigger of the weapon. They turned the body over and identified Captain Ben L. Salomon. They began counting his wounds. He had been shot multiple times, bayoneted repeatedly, and struck with the crude wooden spears that Japanese soldiers had fashioned when they ran out of conventional weapons. The count would eventually reach 76 separate wounds. It was difficult to determine which wound had been fatal. There were so many. What was clear was that Ben had continued fighting even after being wounded multiple times. He had stayed at that machine gun, moving it 4 times, holding off wave after wave of attackers. Then they looked at what lay in front of the position. 4 separate piles of Japanese dead were arranged in rough semicircles around the machine gun. They counted the bodies carefully. 98 enemy soldiers lay dead in front of Ben's position. The evidence in the sand told the story. Blood trails showed where Ben had struggled to move the machine gun 4 separate times during the battle. Shell casings were scattered around each position. The ground was torn up from bullets and grenades. It was clear that this single man had held this position for hours against overwhelming numbers. What they had discovered was one of the most remarkable individual defensive stands in American military history. Captain Ben Salomon, a dentist, had killed 98 enemy soldiers while defending wounded patients and buying time for their evacuation. He had been trained as a healer, but had fought and died as a warrior. The blood trail in the sand showed he had moved that machine gun 4 times, each time wounded, each time refusing to stop or retreat. He had bought precious minutes that allowed medics to evacuate wounded soldiers who would have otherwise been slaughtered. General Greiner stood looking at Ben's body for several moments. Then he did something that would have profound consequences for the next 58 years. He bent down and cut the Red Cross armband off Ben's sleeve. This action suggested that Greiner was already thinking about how to handle the situation. Under the Geneva Convention, medical personnel were marked with the Red Cross and were not supposed to engage in combat operations. Greiner may have thought he was protecting Ben's reputation, or he may have been preparing to reject any medal recommendations. His motivation remains unclear. Over the next few weeks, Captain Edmund Love, the division historian, assembled documentation for Medal of Honor recommendations. The Medal of Honor was and remains the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government, given only for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Love prepared recommendations for 3 individuals who had fought with extraordinary valor during the Japanese Gyokusai attack. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, commander of the 1st Battalion, who had fought heroically before being killed, received a Medal of Honor recommendation. Captain John O'Brien, a company commander who had also fought with exceptional courage before being killed, received a Medal of Honor recommendation, and Captain Ben L. Salomon received a Medal of Honor recommendation based on his actions defending the aid station and holding the machine gun position. The first 2 recommendations were approved and eventually awarded. O'Brien and O'Brien both received their Medals of Honor posthumously, and their families were presented with the medals in ceremonies that honored their sacrifice. But Ben Salomon's recommendation followed a different path. When it reached General Greiner's desk, the general wrote across it, "Disapproved." His reasoning warning was recorded. Ben had been a medical officer, and medical personnel were not supposed to take up arms against the enemy under the Geneva Convention. This was a fundamental misunderstanding of the Geneva Convention. Medical personnel absolutely have the right to defend themselves and the wounded in their care. They can use weapons in self-defense and in defense of their patients. What they cannot do is engage in offensive combat operations or take up arms for purposes other than immediate defense. Ben's actions were clearly defensive. He had been attacked in his aid station while treating wounded soldiers. He had fought to protect helpless patients and to allow their evacuation. Every action he took was consistent with the duties and rights of medical personnel under the Geneva Convention. But General Greiner, for whatever reason, did not forward the recommendation. It stopped at his desk. The first attempt to recognize Ben Solomon's heroism failed in 1944, just months after his death. Ben's father, back in Southern California, was notified of his son's death, but received few details. He knew Ben had been killed on Saipan, but he didn't know the circumstances. He didn't know about the 98 enemy soldiers. He didn't know about the machine gun or the hours-long battle. He didn't even receive the Purple Heart Medal that Ben had earned for being wounded and killed in action. The War Department was overwhelmed with casualty notifications and medal processing. Ben's paperwork was lost in the shuffle. After the war ended in 1945, Captain Edmund Love returned to the United States and resumed his civilian life. He took a position at the Pentagon in the Center of Military History, where he became a prolific writer. He wrote several articles about the battles in the South Pacific, including detailed accounts of the fighting on Saipan. He also wrote articles about the Army's awards policy, particularly focusing on cases where he believed deserving soldiers had not been properly recognized. One of Love's articles about Saipan came to the attention of Ben Solomon's father in Southern California. The article mentioned the battle and some of the soldiers who had fought there. Ben's father, desperate for any information about how his son had died, wrote to the Secretary of War, Judge Robert Patterson. Judge Patterson was moved by the letter from a grieving father who knew almost nothing about his son's death and had never even received his Purple Heart. Patterson asked Captain Love, now Mr. Love as a civilian, to travel to California and meet with Ben's father. Love agreed and made the trip. The meeting was emotional. For the first time, Ben's father learned the full story of how his son had died. Love described the aid station, the Japanese attack, the machine gun position, the 98 enemy soldiers, and the wounds Ben had suffered. He explained that he had personally recommended Ben for the Medal of Honor and couldn't understand why it had been disapproved. Ben's father was overwhelmed by the information. His son had died a hero, had saved countless lives, had fought with extraordinary courage. Yet he had received no recognition, not even the Purple Heart. Judge Patterson was also moved by the story. He asked Edmund Love to write a comprehensive narrative and re-energize the award process. This was no small task. Most of the witnesses had returned to civilian life and were scattered across the country. Many had been killed in subsequent battles, particularly the brutal fight for Okinawa, where the 27th Infantry Division suffered heavy casualties. Love worked on the project for years, tracking down survivors, collecting affidavits, assembling documentation. By 1951, he had put together a complete package with all necessary supporting evidence. But there was a problem. The Medal of Honor had a statute of limitations. Awards had to be made within a certain time frame after the action. By 1951, that window had closed. The paperwork was complete, the evidence was overwhelming, but the award could not be processed. The second attempt to recognize Ben Solomon failed in 1951, 7 years after his death. The story might have ended there, lost to history like so many other untold stories of World War II heroism. But in the 1960s, Congress passed a public law that allowed the statute of limitations to be waived if a member of Congress became involved in advocating for the award. This created a new possibility for Ben's case. In 1969, dental leaders who had learned about Ben Solomon's story decided to make another attempt. Dr. John Engel, dean of the USC School of Dentistry, where Ben had graduated, partnered with Major General Russell B. Shirer to champion a new Medal of Honor recommendation. They engaged Edmund Love, who was still working as a military historian, to help with the process. The paperwork was assembled again, updated with the new statutory provisions. The recommendation went forward through proper channels. The Army Senior Decorations Board voted to approve the Medal of Honor for Captain Ben L. Salomon. The Secretary of the Army, Stanley Resor, reviewed the file and recommended approval. The package moved up to the Secretary of Defense and the White House for final approval, which was standard procedure for Medal of Honor awards. And there it stopped. The Secretary of Defense and the White House demurred. They did not formally reject the award, but they did not approve it either. It simply languished without action. The third attempt to recognize Ben Salomon failed in 1969, 25 years after his death. The reasons for the rejection were never fully explained, but historians have speculated about several possibilities. Some have suggested that there was lingering concern about the Geneva Convention issue, despite the fact that Ben's actions were clearly defensive. Others have suggested that the political environment of 1969, with growing anti-war sentiment regarding Vietnam, made the administration reluctant to highlight stories of individual combat heroics. Still others have suggested simple bureaucratic inertia and risk aversion, with officials unwilling to approve an unusual case that broke the statute of limitations, even though Congress had provided the legal mechanism to do so. In 1979, the Army Medical Department decided to take action even without the Medal of Honor. They named a dental clinic after Ben Salomon. The Ben Salomon Dental Clinic opened at Fort Gordon, Georgia, a permanent facility that would serve soldiers for decades to come. It was a meaningful gesture of respect and remembrance, but it was not the recognition that Ben's heroism deserved. That same year, a young dental officer named Patrick Scully was completing his senior year of residency training at Fort Knox. He attended the Academy of General Dentistry meeting in Atlanta and took a side trip to visit Colonel Clement Daniel Egan, one of his old mentors. Colonel Egan was now the chief of the newly opened Ben Salomon Dental Clinic. On a Saturday afternoon, St. Patrick's Day of 1979, Colonel Egan gave Scully a tour of the clinic and told him the story of Ben Salomon. He described the battle on Saipan, the 98 enemy soldiers, and all the failed attempts to get Ben the Medal of Honor he deserved. Scully, a young captain at the time, remembered thinking what a great opportunity it would be to support recognition for such a brave man. He filed the story away in his memory, not knowing that nearly 2 decades later, he would have the power to do something about it. By 1998, Colonel Patrick Scully had risen through the ranks to become a major general. He was selected to be the 23rd Chief of the Army Dental Corps and assigned as Deputy Surgeon General of the United States Army. This made him one of the most senior medical officers in the military and gave him significant influence over personnel matters and awards. As soon as General Scully arrived at the office of the Surgeon General, he inquired about the status of the Ben Salomon files. Were they available? Could they be located? The Army historian Dr. John Greenwood confirmed that the files still existed and that there was renewed interest from the University of Southern California. USC was celebrating its centennial, and a dentist named Dr. Robert West had learned about Ben Salomon's story. Dr. West was eager to re-energize the Medal of Honor process. Colonel John King, the Dental Corps historian, had shared the 1969 files with Dr. West, who had been studying them carefully. Dr. West had reached out to Congressman Brad Sherman, who represented the district where USC was located, and Congressman Sherman had agreed to sponsor legislation to waive the statute of limitations once again. The pieces were falling into place. General Scully made it his personal mission to see this through. He worked behind the scenes to keep the paperwork moving through the bureaucracy. This was delicate work. He couldn't simply order the Medal of Honor to be awarded. That authority rested with the Secretary of Defense and ultimately the President. But he could make sure that staff actions moved efficiently, that the file didn't get buried in someone's in-basket, that the necessary reviews were completed on schedule. In December 1999, the Army's Senior Decorations Board met to consider the Ben Salomon case for the 4th time. After reviewing all the evidence, the testimony, and the historical record, they voted to recommend approval of the Medal of Honor. This was the same conclusion they had reached 30 years earlier, but now there was a renewed sense of momentum. General Scully's role now shifted to keeping the file moving through higher levels of approval. He had to remind staff officers to keep working the action, to prioritize it among the hundreds of other tasks on their desks. It was painstaking work, requiring persistence and diplomatic skill. On January 20th, 2001, Inauguration Day, there was a change of administration from President Bill Clinton to President George W. Bush. This created both an opportunity and a risk. A new administration meant new decision-makers who might view the case differently. General Scully received a phone call that day from Mr. Patrick Henry, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower and Reserve Affairs. Henry informed Scully that his last official action as Assistant Secretary was to carry the completed staff package down to the Secretary of the Army. Secretary Louis Caldera signed the document recommending approval of the Medal of Honor for Captain Ben L. Salomon. The recommendation now moved to the Office of the Secretary of Defense for the next 8 months. It was staffed through multiple offices, reviewed by military lawyers, examined by historians, and scrutinized by policy officials. In October 2001, General Scully received the good news he had been waiting for. The National Defense Authorization Act for 2002 included a provision specifically waiving the statute of limitations for Ben Salomon and authorizing the award of the Medal of Honor. The act was passed by Congress and signed by President George W. Bush on December 28, 2001, exactly 57 years after Ben had been killed on Saipan. With the law signed, the award was now official, but it still had to be presented. The White House began making arrangements for a ceremony. General Scully had a retirement date of his own scheduled for May 10, 2002, and he was deeply concerned that the ceremony might not take place before he retired. He wanted to witness the moment he had worked so hard to achieve. In early spring 2002, the call finally came from the White House. The ceremony was scheduled for May 1, 2002, in the Rose Garden. General Scully would be there after all. Ben's family was long gone by this time. As an only child, he had no siblings or direct descendants. The family that remained was the University of Southern California Dental School, which had produced him, and the United States Army Dental Corps, which he had served. Both would be represented at the ceremony. On May 1, 2002, in the Rose Garden of the White House, President George W. Bush presented the Medal of Honor to Dr. Robert West, accepting it on behalf of Ben Salomon and the University of Southern California. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." Many of the people who had championed the award over the decades were present that day. Lieutenant General Russell B. Shearer, who had first advocated for the award back in 1969, was there just shy of his 92nd birthday. General Patrick Scully was there, having finally achieved what he had set out to do 23 years earlier when he first heard the story. Mr. Patrick Henry was there, along with Secretary Louis Caldera. Dr. John Engel from USC was there. Multiple Medal of Honor recipients from other wars attended to honor a new member of their exclusive brotherhood. The ceremony was emotional for everyone present. It had been 58 years since Ben Salomon's death, 58 years of bureaucratic obstacles, rejected recommendations, expired statutes of limitations, and persistent advocacy by people who believed in doing the right thing. The next day, May 2nd, was the Hall of Heroes ceremony at the Pentagon, where Ben's citation and image were enshrined alongside all other Medal of Honor recipients. Secretary of the Army Thomas White presented Dr. West with another item, the Purple Heart Medal that Ben Salomon's father had never received back in 1944. That Purple Heart now resides at the University of Southern California Dental School, a tangible connection to the man whose heroism had inspired so many. Immediately after the Hall of Heroes ceremony, Dr. West presented the actual Medal of Honor to General Scully. Scully had a specific plan for what to do with it. On May 10, 2002, his retirement day, General Scully held his retirement parade at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. After the parade concluded, Scully walked across the street to the United States Army Medical Department Museum. There, in his last official act as an active duty officer, he presented Ben Salomon's Medal of Honor to the museum so it could be displayed forever for soldiers and visitors to see. That same day, across the country at Fort Benning, Georgia, the Army rededicated the Salomon Dental Clinic with a new sign, "In memory of Captain Ben L. Salomon, Medal of Honor recipient." The recognition that had taken 58 years to achieve was now complete. Ben Salomon's story provides several important lessons about war, heroism, and human nature. The first lesson is that heroism occurs at the intersection of character and circumstance. Ben had the character, forged through years of training and competition, to be an excellent soldier. When circumstance placed him in an impossible situation, that character manifested as extraordinary courage. The second lesson is that there should never be a statute of limitations on doing the right thing. Multiple people refused to give up on recognizing Ben's heroism, even when the system said it was too late. Edmund Love spent years assembling documentation. Dental leaders kept advocating, congressmen sponsored legislation, military leaders kept the paperwork moving, General Scully made it his personal mission. Because of their persistence, virtue was ultimately recognized even if it took nearly 6 decades. The third lesson is that the great character of one person brings out the great character in many others. Ben Solomon's heroism inspired everyone who learned about it to fight for his recognition. People who had never met him, who were born long after he died, committed themselves to ensuring his legacy would not be forgotten. Dr. Shearer, Dr. Engel, Captain Love, Mr. Henry, Secretary Caldera, General Scully, Dr. West, Congressman Sherman, Colonel King, Dr. Greenwood, and many others all played roles in this story. None of them had known Ben personally, but they all felt compelled to honor his sacrifice. Military historians have examined what Ben accomplished on July 7, 1944. He killed 98 enemy soldiers while defending wounded patients, one of the highest single-action kill counts by an American service member in World War II. He bought time that allowed the evacuation of wounded soldiers who would otherwise have been killed. He demonstrated that medics and medical personnel, while dedicated to healing, can and will fight with extraordinary effectiveness when their patients are threatened. He showed that specialist officers, like dentists, can possess combat skills equal to or exceeding those of infantry officers when properly trained. The story also raises questions about the Medal of Honor process and military award systems in general. Ben's case shows how easily recognition can be lost in the fog of war and bureaucracy. If Edmund Love hadn't pushed for recognition, if Ben's father hadn't written to the Secretary of War, if Dr. West hadn't learned the story decades later, if General Scully hadn't made it his mission, Ben Solomon would be an unknown dentist who died on Saipan. His extraordinary heroism would have been lost to history. How many other similar stories were never documented, never pushed through the system, never recognized? The Army has identified this as a systemic problem. During World War II, the chaos of combat meant that many acts of valor went unwitnessed or undocumented. Units that were overrun or destroyed often had no one left to write recommendations. Paperwork was lost, communications failed. In the decades since, the military has tried to improve the awards process, to create redundancies and safeguards, to ensure that heroism is properly documented and recognized in a timely manner. Ben's story resonates because it represents something fundamental about duty and sacrifice. He was a dentist, a healer, someone whose professional oath was to do no harm. But when his patients were threatened, when wounded soldiers who couldn't defend themselves were about to be slaughtered, he took up arms and fought with devastating effectiveness. He didn't hesitate. He didn't agonize over whether this was appropriate for a medical officer. He acted, and his action saved lives. The mathematics of his stand are straightforward. He killed 98 enemy soldiers by himself. Even a conservative estimate suggests he saved the lives of at least 20 to 30 wounded American soldiers who were evacuated while he held the position. Given that those wounded would have been helpless and unable to defend themselves, Ben essentially traded his life for 20 to 30 of his countrymen. By any measure, that represents selfless service of the highest order. Today, Ben Solomon's Medal of Honor resides in the Army Medical Department Museum at Fort Sam, Houston. The Ben Solomon Dental Clinic at Fort Benning serves thousands of soldiers. His story is taught at military medical training courses as an example of the medical officer's duty to protect patients. His name is remembered in dental schools across the country, but perhaps most importantly, his story reminds us that ordinary people, when placed in extraordinary circumstances and guided by strong character, can accomplish remarkable things. Ben Solomon was not a career infantry officer or a special operations soldier. He was a dentist from Los Angeles who won every weapons competition, taught infantry tactics in his spare time, and when the moment came, fought and died as a warrior to protect helpless patients. His legacy is one of selfless service, personal courage, and devotion to duty. 58 years after his death, his country finally said thank you. But the wounded soldiers he saved that night didn't have to wait. They knew immediately, they knew what he had done for them, and they never forgot.